What I want to do is something that's not real easy, and that's to get somebody to change their mind. How do you get somebody to change their mind? You know, we're born into whatever we're going to be taught, and most people will believe that until the day they die. They'll never change because that's how they were taught. That's how they were basically, and I hate to use this word, but indoctrinated. Well, that's just the way it works. But there are people who step outside of that and they learn. Years ago, the Churches of Christ would have gospel meetings that would last for a week, 2 weeks, whatever. We're kind of engaged in that here today. But and they would pack the house. There'd be not even standing room for these sermons. But here's the difference between today and the yesteryear that I'm talking about. Those people in the yesteryear, they didn't have a phone to put in their face, and they didn't have computers or probably mostly not even television, really. So even before television. So they didn't have that entertainment, so they would go to get entertained. And of course they would hear the truth and maybe at least portions of it and change their lives and so forth. But you are not here for entertainment. You are here because you want to know the truth. And that's what sets this people, this time that we're in, apart from any of those other times. So you might only have a group of 20 or 30 or 40, maybe 50 people who assemble, who believe this, which I believe is scriptural, by the way. Steve and I have had this conversation. There's smaller groups. But they're there because they want to be. And they want to learn. And so you're to be commended for that. So let's learn some of these things. You see up on the screen up here this term periday, and as Brent was talking about the Greek words. Yeah, we need to do more work on that, no, without question. But this is a little intimidating. If you're new to study and you're new to this concept, these Greek words are intimidating. I've had, and probably all of us guys in here have ever talked to somebody. We've had them say to us, well, you don't need the Greek. You don't need to understand the Greek. And they just say ridiculous things. But yes, we do need to understand the Greek. Paul said, I wrote these things so that you may understand. And did he write in English? No, he wrote in Greek. Greek-ish, really. It was Hebrew relates to Greek, I'm sure. But anyway, so this is very, very intimidating. But this is the word that we see in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 36. So when Brent asked me to do this, I'm thinking, how do I approach this? Because this is extensive. I don't have enough time to do all of this. I'm going to do my best to give you a lot. But one little word, well, two really, boils down to this idea of but in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 36. But of that day and hour. Okay? Nobody knows. This is how people present this, and this is their argument. Well, Jesus didn't even know when he was going to come. I'm going to show you something here, and I'm not going to use extensive PowerPoints or anything. This is very basic. I put all these slides, printed them out. There's a place you can make notes. I don't know if they're able to get that or not. If you want that, let me know. But this concept is proven out by the context. It's not a contrast. It's a continuation. I'm going to show you that. But what I want you to do is have a Bible. I open mine and I read it. And I want to show you something. So if you look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, this same terminology is used here. It's the same periday. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. But just to kind of give you a basis for what we're talking about. So in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, it starts out saying the same thing, periday in the Greek. But moreover concerning now, or sometimes they just simply say but. And it's a conjunction. You know what a conjunction is, right? You know what the function of a conjunction is. I know there are certain groups in here that's the first thing that you thought. That's where I go.
What's the function?
Hooking up cars and trains and
And making them function.
And making them function, right. So we all get that. So now we all know Greek based on Saturday morning cartoons. But anyway, so let me get over here to, y'all are going to, yeah, there you go, anyway. Okay, so in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, look at the first verse. This is New American Standard, but the King James says concerning now, I think. Anyway, this says, now as to the times and the epochs, he says, brethren, you know. Well, back in Acts chapter 1, they asked, and he said, well, it's not for you to know. So now they know. Why did they know all these years later? What a real long time later, actually. It's because they were going through the process that we talked about, and it takes time to learn. Now, there is no way possible that you can separate, and nobody's going to do this, separate 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and chapter 5 and say that it's something different because period has been used here. Well, the same thing occurs in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 36. So let's spend the bulk of our time talking about this. I don't even know when I started, Brent. So I have 40 minutes from now, is that? Yep. Close enough? Okay. Okay, so Matthew chapter 24. So Matthew chapter 24 is the epicenter of New Testament prophecy. This is Jesus' Olivet Discourse. Now, I think if you were going to go to the Old Testament, I would say Deuteronomy, 28 through 32 is probably that, at least pretty close. But so, Matthew 24 and verse 36. Oh, hey, I need to get this started here. I had said there that this is the most confusing verse, and it is, but C.S. Lewis actually said that it's the most embarrassing verse. And here's the reason why. In he was speaking in verse 34. He says, it's certainly the most embarrassing verse in the Bible, yet how teasing also, that within 14 words of it should come the statement, but of that day and hour knoweth no man, no not the angels which are in heaven, neither the Son, but the Father. He says, the one exhibition of error and the one confession of ignorance grow side by side. He saw the problem, the very problem that we're talking about here today. So maybe you've come across this, and I just want to make this just as simple as I possibly can. If you've ever read anything of these prophecies, you're starting to look into these things, you're starting to see these things. Certainly you've read verse 36 and you've looked at that. And someone's pointed it out to you. Jesus, even he didn't know, they say. Well, let me point some things out here. In this Olivet Discourse, Jesus, or Yeshua, actually, refers several times to not only Daniel. I mean, he outright quotes Daniel, and he says, go back and read Daniel. But he quotes Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah, Ezekiel, Joel, and I know I'm leaving some out. And he quotes these prophets. And if we don't know the prophets, we cannot understand what Jesus is saying. And he said that himself, didn't he? Look here in John chapter 5. He says, how can you believe when you receive glory from one another and you do not seek the glory that is from the one and only God? Do not think that I will accuse you before the Father. By the way, I think that's a reference, this accusation here, to Deuteronomy 31. But do not think I will accuse you before the Father. The one who accuses you is Moses, in whom you have set your hope. For if you believe Moses, you believe me, for he wrote about me. But, here's the kicker about this. If you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? If you want to know what Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse is talking about, we have got to know the prophets. We have got to understand these, if you want to put it this way, these Old Testament references. And without that, we will never get it. So you can go to Matthew 24 and verse 36, and you can say, well, Jesus didn't even know the day or the hour. I'm going to show you here that they understood what that meant. So, anyway, let's keep on going. So, here's the verse. But of that day and hour, no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. So that makes plain and clear sense, right? To all of us who are alive in 2000, what year is this, 24? To all of us who are alive now, Makes plain and clear sense. If you want to ignore 3/4 of the Bible, and then you're going to interpret the rest of it wrong. So here's where I think we need to look. So this word "para," it means about, concerning, around. So you can look these up. Matter of fact, you can go to Blue Letter Bible. You can go, I think that's .org. You can go to Bible Hub. I don't know. There's several. Just get online. There's all sorts of free information that you can get, and you can look at Strong's. You don't even have to have a paper copy. It's nice to have that, but you don't even have to. You don't have to have a book. You've got it in your pocket. So we need to learn to do these things. And then this word "day" means simply but, and, now, and so forth. So this is not real hard. But is this a transition verb? Okay, is it a transition verb? Word. Well, if it is, then it's going to transition through it because it's used several times throughout Jesus' speech. So does that mean every time he uses the word "day" that it goes from this topic, what's this? We're going to shift to another one? No, it doesn't do that. The only reason it does in verse 36 in the mind of the futurist is because they need it to.
That's right.
So the Olivet Discourse is not the first time the disciples heard this topic. You know, I think sometimes we think they were all just kind of ignorant, don't we? We think, well, they didn't know anything, but they did. Let me point something out, and I just put a few verses up here. So Matthew 5, Jesus says, well, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So immediately we think, well, heaven and earth is the dirt in the sky, right? But he said it didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. And then he uses this way of speaking to say it again a different way. Heaven and earth will pass away. The law and the prophets, heaven and earth, will pass away. But my words, this new covenant, will not pass away. The old covenant's going to pass away. The new one will not pass away. Matthew chapter 10, verse 23, he tells his disciples, he says, listen, you will not finish going through the city of Israel before the Son of Man be come. So if you were one of the people that he said that to, what would you think? You would know, maybe, what he was talking about. If you didn't, you would ask him. And I'm sure that they did. They had lots of time to spend with him. They were walking from here to there, and certainly they're going to have conversations. And they're going to ask him, well, Yeshua, what did you mean when you said that? And he's going to explain it to them. So they had lots of time to talk about these things. And that was evidence, I think Roy brought up, somebody did today, might have been somebody brought it up. When he asked, do you understand these things? And they said yes. So Matthew chapter 16, verses 27 and 28, this is all before the Olivet Discourse, before Matthew 24, verse 36. He said, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Do you suppose that they thought in their mind, well, it's going to be a couple thousand years? No. Some standing here will see me coming in my kingdom. Luke 17. This one is just fantastic. This probably answers any argument anyone wants to make about Matthew 24. Because Luke 17 doesn't have it in the same order. I think I have that chart next. We'll see. Yeah. So look at this. So if you're familiar with Luke 17, some will say, well, this is not the Olivet Discourse. And they're 100% right about that. It's not. It was before the Olivet Discourse. So this proves that these guys knew about these topics before the Olivet Discourse. Now that's important. I'll show you why in just a moment. But look at this. I won't take time to go through this, but you can see how you've got Matthew 24 all lined up here, and then Luke 7, which says the exact same things, and it's all jumbled up. Now that doesn't mean Luke 17 is messed up by any means, but what it does mean is that it's the same information, but the order is not necessarily needed to prove his point. So there's that. But the reason this is all important here is because in Matthew 24, and this is just a few things that I pulled out to show you some things. In Matthew chapter 24, he is talking to some people. And the biggest problem with most of us, before we understood fulfillment, we thought whenever something in the Bible said you, that it meant you. And the fact is, now, don't throw tomatoes at me. Well, maybe. I like tomatoes. Might catch a couple of them. But the fact of the matter is, the Bible was not written for you and me. Not like it was spoken to them and recorded. And now we read it. So in that way, it is for us. But it wasn't written to us. And the information there is for us, and what we see and what we read and what we hear and what we understand. We get to put all this in order in our minds and realize just how good we've got it.
That's right.
So, let's talk about some of these usual arguments. I thought about doing what Roy did and all those little arrows and let's do this, and then I said, nah, that's not me. I can't do that. But these are some of the usual arguments either that I would make, or maybe that's made about Matthew chapter 24, specifically verse 36. Now, what I want you to understand is we're looking at the context here. Not only to make these arguments, but this is kind of the basis of all this. If Matthew 24, verse 36, but that day and hour nobody knows, not even Jesus himself. By the way, does anybody ever notice that Jesus knew in Revelation? Just saying. So, the context bears out what verse 36 is talking about. So let's talk about this a little bit. So they asked these three questions. What? Was it three questions? By the way, did they ask three questions? No.
5 at least.
5 at least?
5 at least, yeah.
But it's all the same thing. It's all the same topic. It's all regarding the same issue that they had already talked about. Remember, we just established that. We looked at Luke 17, some of the other verses. There's so many more other verses that you could go to illustrate that they knew, they were familiar with this topic, and then with Jesus introducing this to them and discussing it with them. So they asked these three questions. Well, one of the things that comes to my mind immediately is this idea that they did not believe that the world was going to come to an end. If you're new to preterism, this might be a new thought to you, but the Bible nowhere teaches that the earth will be blown to smithereens at some point at the end of its history. I do not believe that the Bible is a history book for earth. It's an information book. It's got some of the history of earth in it, but not all of it. It has the pertinent information that we need to be able to understand things and live our lives accordingly and honor the King and honor the Creator. So the very first thing that we need to understand, Ecclesiastes 1:4 says that the earth will abide forever. Now, I understand covenantal language there, and I get that. But you can't have this figurative language without something physical to compare it to. So if you understand that the earth is here, and some would say, well, it's going to get blown up. The writer of Ecclesiastes says, no, it's not. And as a matter of fact, you see the same language used in Ephesians chapter 3, the same concept anyway, and verse 21 that says the world will always be around. In the in the New American Standard, it says unto the age of the ages, I think is the terminology that it uses. And that is this phrase, a Greek phrase, that is used to denote endlessness, essentially. So this would not have been on their radar. This was not an app that they downloaded somewhere along the line saying that the earth is going to be destroyed somewhere. No. So, from that standpoint alone, it's a very simple argument to make. From that standpoint alone, they weren't asking about the end of the world. They were asking about the end of the aeon, or the age. Only two ages exist in Scripture, basically, especially that the Jews would have been concerned with. It was the age of Moses and the age of Messiah. Now, the age of Moses comes to an end, and the age of Messiah does not. Ever. Consider the context of Ephesians 3. You go back to chapter 2, realize this, that the church is eternal. So it makes perfect sense when you get to verse 21 in the next chapter that the church is never going to end. Now, what's the purpose of the church? To teach and to evangelize. This was the question from the brother earlier here just a moment ago. This is the purpose of the church. The purpose of the church is eternal. It was built, and it's not like stuff we build today. I mean, years ago we built good stuff and it would last for 30, 40, 50 years. My grandma had one of those General Electric refrigerators. That thing's probably still working now. And it was 50 years old when I was a kid. But what was built in the first century during that transition period is eternal. So that wouldn't even been on their radar. When's the earth going to be destroyed? They weren't asking that question. So, and I know there's more to be said about those three questions, but let's move on to the next one. This is an argument that's made about those days and that day. So in chapter 26, or I'm sorry, chapter 24 of Matthew, just turn over here. Let me show you a few things. In those days, and then in that day. So what they say is, those days are referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. Which this one kind of blows me away. When I was a kid, I'll show you this in just a second. There's a section here in those days that surely sounds like the end of the world, doesn't it? So what they say is those days were leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. But then he transitions in verse 36, because nobody knows the day or the hour, to that day, which would be the end of the world. That's a huge problem. Because look at this. In those days, let me show you something. Look here at verse 27. Starting in verse 27, listen to this. He says, for the lightning, let me get some light here so I can see this. For the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west. And until, let's try this again. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Well, sounds a little prophetic to me, right? Listen to this. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heaven will be shaken, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. This is New American Standard. Or the sign of the Son of Man will appear in, it should be the heaven. But, lost my place. And then the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Really? With power and great glory. What does this sound like? Is this pre-transition verse? Is this the destruction of Jerusalem or the end of the world? I heard preachers all the time when I was a kid. Church of Christ preachers preaching this as the end of the world. Now they've changed their mind some reason. I don't know. It's probably because of old. And he will send forth these angels. This is resurrection language, by the way. Study that out and you'll see it. He will send these angels to the try this again, with the great trumpet, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, in verse 34, the most confusing, the most what did C.S. Lewis call it? The most embarrassing verse. Mm-hmm. He says all these things are going to come to fruition, will take place in this generation. What generation is that? Well, maybe it's the generation that it happens to. You know, or whatever generation it happens to, it's going to come quickly. You know, those arguments just simply don't make sense. But here's what does make sense. Look in your Bibles, and you're going to want to mark some of these things. So if you have a pen, turn to Leviticus chapter 12, 13, and 14. And what I'm going to show you here is this idea of that day. The argument is made that that day is the end of the world, right? Why did I put Leviticus? That's Zechariah. Sorry. There's some points I want to make out of Leviticus too, if I have time. But anyway, so look here in Zechariah chapter 12. We'll just start in chapter 12. Now look at the first verse. It says, now here's what I want you to do with your pen. I want you to mark this in your Bible. It says, the burden of the word of the Lord, or the prophecy of the word of the Lord, concerning Israel. So who's this about? This is about Israel. Thus declares the Lord, who stretches out the heavens, lays the foundation of the earth. There's that heaven and earth language again. About Israel. And who forms the spirit of man within him. Behold, he says, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling in all the peoples around. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Judah. Now, here's where I want you to mark a few things. I'll leave this to you to study. Read through this. But you're going to see here, and I'll show you a couple of these things as we go along. He says in verse 3, he says, it will come about in that day. What day is that? When Jerusalem becomes a cup of reeling. Did that happen in one day? Is that one single day? No. As you read through chapter 12, 13, and 14, you see that this is a culmination of several days, and time passes, but it's referred to in that day. It's this events that are scheduled, prophetically scheduled to take place and to bring about certain things. So there's the first one. In that day. In verse 4, in that day. Verse 6, in that day. And so on and so forth. And I think it's used like 17 times throughout 3 chapters. So in chapter 12, you can read here that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. In chapter 13, well, as a matter of fact, in chapter 12 also, you can see in that day, verse 9, he says, I will set about to destroy all the nations who come against Jerusalem. See, the gathering of the nations? I mean, this stuff's just all there. You see, in that day, they'll see Jesus. They'll look upon Him whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for Him. Isn't that Revelation 1:7? It sure is. And all these things are going to take place in that day. Well, in chapter 13, what is that day? It's the day when salvation comes, when the waters start flowing out of Jerusalem. Look at chapter 13, verse 1. In that day, a fountain will be opened for the house of David. What is this fountain? This is when salvation comes. This is the free waters that we've sang about all of our lives. In that day. Now I'll say this, just as a sideline real quick. Our brethren who believe in the future coming of Jesus are still waiting for salvation to come. No way. Salvation came in the first century when Jesus fulfilled all things. We live in the glory of that fulfillment today. Anyway, in the 13th chapter, we see in that day, the false prophet will stop prophesying. He'll be cast, the unclean spirits cast out of the land. We still waiting for that to happen? What is that day? In the 14th chapter, just read through the 14th chapter and you will see, without a doubt, that in that day, and it just continues on, that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. The Lord will stand on one side of the river and on the other side of the river. One bank and on the other bank. This is the day in chapter 14, verse 8, that living waters will flow out of Jerusalem. Here it is again. This is when salvation takes place. Are we still waiting for it? Are we still waiting for that day? No. And as a matter of fact, I have a sneaking hunch that when the people in the first century heard these words coming out of Jesus' mouth, because they should have been pretty well versed in their Old Testament, right? In that Old Covenant, and the law and the prophets, that they would have thought about this. That this might have stuck out in their head. Because that's what Jesus was talking about. He was talking about the signs that were going to take place. He was talking about, matter of fact, we'll talk about this in just a second, about his parousia. And these are all things that took a little bit of time to do. About 3.5 years, essentially. In that day. So here's what happens. in verse 14, or chapter 14, verse 16, listen to this. Then it will come about that all who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths. Now, if you don't understand the feasts, you're going to be lost on so much of this language. What's this have to do with Perry Day or concerning now or but? What's it have to do with that? It's the context of what they were talking about. Because people today would say it's a transition, and the context says no, it's not. I'm going to show you this as we continue to go along. What about this parousia? Who talked about that? Was that Roy? Spent a good chunk of his time talking about that, so I don't have to go through that a lot. But let me point something out about this parousia. It's used 2 times. This term parousia is used 2 times before the transition verse, and it's used 2 times after the transition verse, which means there is no transition verse. That's pretty clear. Now, one of the interesting things about parousia, it is feast of, it's the 7 feast language. It's the coming of the Lord. The parousia is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. It's a royal visit. The royal visit is when royalty comes, say they're going to come to a city. Hey, I'm coming to your city. The word goes out. Well, they come out to meet him, and he meets them halfway, and then they go back to the city, and he stays there with them for a while. That is not what our brethren teach. Our brethren teach that he's going to come back, he's going to wait in the clouds until everybody gets sucked up off the earth and meets him there, then he's going to take them back to heaven, and that's not the case. It's the Feast of Booths language. When the Lord comes down from heaven, and he comes down and dwells with his people, and celebrates with them, which is where we're at today. More on that later. He uses this word "you" 22 times in Matthew chapter 24. Is it possible that any single one of those "yous" pertain to any person in this room? It's not at all possible. Matter of fact, it is impossible. 22 times he pointed out to the people he was speaking to. 22 times. And I already read about the glorious return of the Lord. You know something? That the reason I put that in quotes is your Bible probably has that there as a little subtopic. Even they understood it incorrectly back then. Well, and correctly. They didn't realize they were understanding it incorrectly. But that's the return of the Lord. And it happened to the people in the first century that he said it would happen to. That is significant. If there's one thing that you need to get by the time you leave these lectures, these series of talks this weekend, is that these things were prophesied to happen in their lifetime, not ours. If any of those prophecies of Jesus that were slated to happen in their lifetime, their generation, to the people standing there, didn't happen, then that makes Jesus what?
A liar. False prophet.
A liar and a false prophet. And you're not to be afraid of him. You're not to listen to him. Thankfully, they were all fulfilled. Every single one of them. Where's my clicker? Next. These unusual arguments. So these are things that maybe you haven't thought a whole lot about. Maybe haven't used. So you probably have, especially the squad over here. The good squad. Maybe you thought about these or not. But have you ever thought about chapter 25? We often disconnect chapter 25, for some reason, I don't know why, from chapter 24. Maybe it's a little hard to answer these things. What do they mean? What is chapter 25? What is he talking about in chapter 25? Well, because there are no chapter divisions, those are all man-made, right? He's still talking about the same thing. All the way through the end of his speech, it is exactly the same thing. Now, let me illustrate this to you. All right? So, in chapter 24, at the end of chapter 24, they're starting about verse 42 and following, he says some things like, therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. Oh man, he just threw a wrench on my plans, right? No. No, because everything, remember, we have to keep all of this in context. So if everything before verse 36 is about their generation, the sun and the moon and stars falling from the sky, the gathering of the four winds, them seeing Him coming on the clouds, if all that is about the first century generation, and Jesus did say this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. How do you get around that? Then what about the verses after? Well, I'll show you. So, he says, but, be sure of this, verse 43, that if the head of the house had known what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert. Now here's how it works. If you know a thief is coming into your house, you sit back, you relax, and you say, oh, he's coming. It'll be a couple thousand years. I got all kinds of time. No. There's not a man in here worth his salt that would not protect his family, and he would not stay up all night long. All night. And wait for him to come in his lifetime. Right? So that's not tough. And this is the same thing through every last story, if you want to call them that, through the end of chapter 25. Even the judgment day. Well, let's look at some of these things. What about in chapter 25? I'm just going to kind of skip over some of these. So the kingdom of heaven will be comparable to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Now, did these young girls, probably 12 years old or so, they would have been relatively young. Did they go out and wait for somebody who wasn't going to come in their lifetime? That's ludicrous. That doesn't follow the theme of the Olivet Discourse at all. You can't extrapolate that. You can't find that anywhere in that story. They were waiting for someone who they knew was coming. The interesting thing about this, study on this, the marriage rituals in the first century of the Jews mimic the coming of the Lord. It is unbelievable. And because they understood that, and they understood that language, when Jesus used it, they went, oh yeah, I get it. But when we hear it and we don't understand that, we don't have that audience relevance going on, it's lost on us. Which is to be expected. If you don't have that background information, you're just going to come up with something that sounds good to you, which is called futurism. What about the parable of the 10 talents? So this guy says, well, I'm going to distribute to you all, the three of you, and you make some money on this. And then when I come back, there's going to be an accounting. Now, did any one of those three say, oh, it's going to be a long time? No, as a matter of fact, earlier, one in the other story, one of them said, oh, he's going to be a long time. And was it a long time? Nope. He came in their lifetime. In each and every story here, he came in their lifetime, and the accounting was made, which brings you up to the judgment. So, does it switch to a new topic all of a sudden in verse 31 and following? No. It's all about the same thing. So, judgment was coming upon Jerusalem, coming upon the Jews. The cup of reeling was full now. And it was time to pay the piper. That's what Matthew 24:25 is about. That's what the Olivet Discourse is about. But if you don't understand the feast, and I think this is another thing that we need to learn about. If you don't understand the feast, you're just going to miss it. I'll just have to run a little short here. I should have just preached on the feast. But so in Leviticus chapter 23, you have these feasts. There's 7 feasts of Israel. Now, you've heard this talked about many, many times. People refer to it. But the most, some preachers refer to it. They don't really get into it much. And the most popular feast that you know about, you don't even really know it's a feast, is Pentecost. So whenever I ask people about Pentecost, the Feast of Pentecost, they're like, yeah, that's Acts chapter 2. They don't even know it's one of the 7 feasts. That's a problem. Leviticus 23 gives the timeline for the feast that they were to do. So they did this for 1,500 years. 1,500 years before Messiah came. And the reason they did this for 1,500 years was to get every man, woman, and child familiar with this information so that when the events took place, they would lift up their heads and say, here it is. Here comes my salvation, finally. After 1,500 years. This is what they should have done in the first century. But they missed it. You want to know why they missed it? Because they didn't care to learn it. They did it, but they didn't learn it. That would be the same thing that I did for many years. I took the Lord's Supper faithfully every week. I did it, but I didn't know about it, truly know about it, and understand it until preterism. Then I started looking at everything and re-examining, why do I do this? You know, if I was wrong about the coming of the Lord, that's a pretty big thing to be wrong about. If I was wrong about that, maybe I'm wrong about the Lord's Supper. Maybe I'm wrong about baptism. What if I'm wrong about, I got that wrong, maybe I'm wrong about baptism. So I go back and I start looking at everything. And there are a lot of things that we've got right in the traditional churches of Christ. There are a lot of things that we do that we don't understand. That's what happens then. So you have these feasts. The first feast is I always get brain blocked on the name of that. It's Passover. Okay, so you got the first feast is Passover. Then you got unleavened bread. Then you got first fruits. And then the fourth one in the spring feast is, anybody know what the fourth one is? It's Pentecost. Yeah. Now, you've got this Passover illustrates this sacrifice, this blood that needed to be shed, the blood on the lintels and the doorpost, right? And if you're in the house covered by the blood, you were saved, right? We all get that. And that was in reference to Jesus, and they had to sacrifice a lamb. And do you know when Jesus was sacrificed, it was at the exact same time when the high priest was sacrificing the final lamb. The final lamb for Israel. And you know what the high priest would say? It is finished. When he sacrificed the final lamb on that day, he would say it is finished. And at the same time, the high priest was sacrificing that lamb and he would say it's finished. You know what our Savior was doing? It's finished. Was it finished on the cross? No, I don't have time to preach this. Holger did a great... Wait, somebody did a great job talking about... Maybe you were answering a question.
Passover for passing over.
Yeah. Because it wasn't the end of the things. Salvation doesn't come to the coming of the Lord. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 28. Lots of... Isaiah 25 talks about that. I mean, it's just... This is the theme understood in the Scriptures. But you don't understand that if you don't understand the feast. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, released from the bondage in Israel, and they were to commemorate that, or not in Israel, in Egypt. And they were to commemorate that. And the coming of the Lord, the first coming of the Lord, follows those first four feasts. You got first fruits. Jesus was resurrected. They were to take the first fruits out of the ground and offer it to the Lord. And Jesus was the first one out of the ground. There were 7 people resurrected before Jesus in Scripture. Well, actually, he was the 7th, I think. Or maybe there were 7.
No, you're right.
Yeah.
There were 7 prior.
There were 7 prior to him. But he was the only one who defeated Hades. He conquered it. And then the final 3 feasts, you got the Feast of Trumpets. Now, this is where you really need to listen to this. So the Feast of Trumpets is the only feast, because they operate somewhat off of the lunar calendar, that it wasn't prescribed what day. So when you read through Leviticus 23, you'll see this. It wasn't prescribed what day that they would do it, but it had to be on the first day of the month, which they would had to stay outside at nighttime and look for the crescent moon, the 2 horns of the crescent moon. As soon as they see that, then it's the first day of the week. This is a day known only to the Lord. Back in Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 7, I think it is, this is the day known only to the Lord. It's festal language. Jesus was telling us when He would come to fulfill those last 3 feasts. The argument gets so much more complicated and in-depth that I certainly don't even have time to finish it here because I'm really out of time. But I do want to show you one or two more things real quick, as fast as I humanly can. So I'll leave that where it's at, and hopefully it sinks in. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Basically, that's all. But it's not exactly all. And here's the reason I say it's not exactly all. I looked for a good one with Porky Pig in there, and I couldn't find a good one. But it's not exactly all. Everyone, not everyone, but our detractors say, well, what now? If all that happened in the first century, what are we alive for? Really? To help the church grow, to honor what has been done for us? Is salvation nothing? Yeah. And people say, well, then you don't need to go to church anymore. Then you don't understand the Scriptures. Yes, you do need a symbol. That's been addressed. I think it was addressed, wasn't it? Here, or were we talking about it?
We talked about it this morning.
That might be what it was. If you think that you don't need to assemble with those of like precious faith, you have completely missed the whole point of all this. Yeah, sure. There's not been one time in the history of God's people where He didn't want you around others who believe like you do. Not one time. You need them. They need you. Because everybody else out there in the world certainly isn't going to help you get to heaven, right? They're not going to help you see the truth. So you need them. But we live in the best time of man's history. We have more information about Scripture than they had in the first century. Isn't that amazing to think about? I mean, I understand the inspiration and everything, but notwithstanding that, look at what you have in your hand, and you can see it all if you want. But there are some things. I wrote a few notes, but just jotted this down real quick. So there are some things that we need to be thankful for, and these are the benefits of preterism. Don't put the paper. If Jesus didn't fulfill these things, then He was wrong. And the benefit is we have no fear to argue that He was right. And we know that He was right, and He fulfilled all of these things, and you can get up in the morning and you don't have to worry. You know what? One of the benefits of being a preterist is you don't have to get up in the morning and worry about the earth being blown to bits at any time. One of the best sermons I ever preached was on that alone. People would come up and they'd be baptized, and they'd reaffirm their faith in the Lord, and I preached that 4 times, and the 5th time I went to preach it, but got about halfway through it, and I thought, I don't believe this. I can't do this. I cut it short and did a lot of studying and praying after that. We're not waiting for salvation to come. It's here now. Homer was talking about this. I get all this confused. Maybe it was at the house, but we're walking the streets of gold now. You may not see it, but you know it. We have salvation now. We're not waiting for it. You know something? The blood of bulls and goats, this was already brought out here today. I thank Olga again. But the blood of bulls and goats, the best it could do, all those animals that were sacrificed under the old covenant, the best it could do was get you a reservation in Hades. That's it.
Amen.
And then, for some reason, people think it's okay today to cut Jesus off at the knees and the power of what He did and say that His blood and His sacrifice and the things that He did was only good enough to what? Get you a reservation in Hades. And as preterists, we're teaching the full power of the sacrifice. Not just the physical sacrifice. Certainly that was part of it. But that spiritual sacrifice. Read Isaiah 53 if you think I'm wrong about that. And that spiritual sacrifice that had to take place. And Steve got in trouble? Oh, did you get in trouble? Over the spirit blood. But it's true. It's absolutely true. And what He did for us, we have salvation today. We live in victory, not defeat. Right now. We're not waiting for it. We've got it all. We have it all right now. like nobody ever did in history. That's it.